delighted to have you on this side of the ocean. I expect most of you picked up the flyer about this program when you came in, and on the reverse is the bios of both our speakers. Michael, I think I inadvertently libeled you in your bio because we've claimed that you are the author of 9 books. I believe it's more than 9, 10 or more. Anyway, it's a ton of books, as well as a couple hundreds of articles and book chapters on a wide variety of issues relating to China and international relations of the Asia-Pacific. His new book, which I've already mentioned, and which is the excuse for our event today, looks at the Sino-Japanese relationship since the end of the Cold War. Michael has a whole host of distinctions and associations that I will let you research and learn about. I'll simply say he's been associated with a number of prestigious universities such as ANU, Australian National University, University of Michigan, the Fairbanks Center at Harvard, and many others. He's also acted as an advisor to the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Following Michael's presentation, the three of us will then have an informal discussion. Primarily, the two of them will have an informal discussion about some of the broader issues raised by Michael in his book and his presentation. Our second participant in today's event is Yoshi Soeya. Yoshi is the Wilson Center's current Japan Scholar. I hate to say this, but we will soon lose him because he leaves us next month to return to his position at Keio University, where he's director of the Institute for East Asian Studies and professor on the faculty of the law there. Before letting him leave next month, we're going to have an event to give him an opportunity to talk about some of his current research. That event will be in this room at 4 o'clock on January the 21st. Yoshi's current research project looks at the evolution of Japanese security policies in recent decades and asks what would a normal Japan look like. So put that on your calendar right now, if you will. Yoshi, like Michael, has an extraordinary number of books, I think 11 in his case, as well as dozens of articles and book chapters. Like Michael, he has served in official capacities as advisors to important people. In his case, the Office of the Japanese Prime Minister, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and Japan's self-defense forces. Yoshi holds a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. So why don't we get started? I'll invite Michael to come up to the podium now. And then after Michael's presentation, as I say, we'll conduct an informal discussion, leaving, however, plenty of time to bring you into the discussion as well. So, Michael, the podium's yours.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here. And much of it is due very much to Bob Hathaway, and I'm very grateful for his generous introduction. I first started working on Sino-Japanese relations back in 2005 when I was a visiting fellow here. And at that time, you may remember, it looked as if nothing was stopping the relationship from spiraling downwards. And I thought I would look into that and try and explain why that was happening. And on the other hand, just before I left the center, the Abe, who was then the just been made Prime Minister, appeared in Beijing and signed a joint declaration on the Chinese side, which seemed to address some of the big issues between the two, and it involved sort of major concessions, interestingly on the Chinese side as much as on the Japanese side. So I felt that I had to rethink my project, and I put it aside for a while and only came back to it about 18 months or 2 years ago. But really the genesis is from the center, so I'm very pleased to be able to talk about the book here. I should also add that I was told a long time ago by a colleague that the task of academics is not to deal with the latest score, but really to try and explain the nature of the game. And I appreciate from what I've heard in Washington that the main interest is on the latest score. So if you'll forgive me, I'll look back somewhat from that. Now, Sino-Japanese relations are highly complex. They involve, at least in my view, a number of very key issues concerning issues of history, identity, at the same time economic interdependence. There's also the international context in which the relationship has developed. And these are all very closely interdependent, and they're also very much affected by the views of the leaders at the time. So let me start with very briefly on the issue of history. Now, if one were to read most of the newspapers today, one would imagine that the issue of history has been an abiding one, at least on the Chinese side, since the end of the war. But in fact, that is not really the case. Let me quote to you something that Mao said when he was receiving some Japanese visitors. He said, "As you have formally apologized for the debts you incurred in the past, it is not reasonable to ask you for payments of those debts. You cannot be asked to apologize every day, can you? It is not good for a nation to constantly feel guilty, and we can understand this point." So this was said at the time of, if you like, what the Chinese officially regard as their great leader, the founder of the state, and so on. And yet nothing could be different from what leaders in China are currently saying. Now, why the difference? Well, it goes back to issues of identity and legitimacy. Mao's claim to historic legitimacy stemmed from his victory in the Civil War against the party of Chiang Kai-shek. And in addition to which, Mao's central issue was class struggle. And that was linked with his view of the Civil War and his view of the Nationalist Party that had then moved to Taiwan. And the conjunction of that with the United States support for Taiwan, especially linked up with the Korean War, meant that from his perspective, first of all, the problem of China was domestic, and the political one was in terms of class enemies at home. And the depiction in those days of the Japanese in the war, and there were many films and many comic books and so on during that period, put less emphasis on how evil the Japanese were and put much more emphasis on the betrayal by class enemies within China. If you were to look at the films from the 50s and 60s and 70s, especially during the Cultural Revolution period, you will always see that there's a sinister character, a landlord, or a Guomindang person from the cities. You could always tell them very clearly because they used to wear scholarly gowns and wear fedora hats. And at critical moments, this person would betray the revolutionaries, those who were fighting against the Japanese, and seek to side with Japan. And of course, there would be the peasants or working class heroes who would overcome both the Japanese and this bad person. And this linked up more broadly with Mao's claim of that what went wrong in his view in the Soviet Union was because there were people who were close to Stalin who then betrayed him. The primary example from Mao's point of view was Khrushchev. So therefore, the real enemy for Mao was, in many respects, the betrayers of revolution and of the nation within. So as far as dealing with Japan was concerned, the main issue, at least in those days, was to try and separate Japan from the United States. So you can find many statements of Mao saying the Japanese are a great people, their problem is their government, and although some terrible things were done in the war, this was not done by the Japanese people, this was done by this small handful of militarists and others. And when did this change? This changed after the Cultural Revolution, because Mao's successors, headed by Deng Xiaoping, had recognized the enormous damage that Mao's approach and his emphasis on class struggle had done to not just to the Chinese economy, but to the whole identity of China itself. And so Deng, when he became the major leading figure, put the emphasis on unity of the people rather than the divisions that Mao had emphasized. So this meant that the approach to the people in Taiwan and to the Nationalist Party and so on was totally different. Instead of seeing them as class enemies allied with the ultimate enemy, the United States, they were now seen in terms of compatriots with whom unification was necessary. And so from that time onwards, the whole issue of the historical legitimacy of the Communist Party and indeed of the state of China, the People's Republic, changed. No longer was it based on the victory in the Civil War, because after all, what we wanted to do was reach out to the defeated party in the Civil War. So the historical legitimacy then went back to the victory over Japan. And to start with, it was claimed that the main force in that was the Communist Party. But then as time evolved, the contribution of the Nationalist Party was also emphasized. Because after all, you could hardly claim to be speaking of the unity of the Chinese people and see the war with Japan mainly in terms of the Communist Party against the Japanese. So you'll find in museums now about that, the nationalists are very much seen as major contributors. But it's also interesting to note that the first public demonstrations against Japan over the war took place in 1982. The first museums commemorating the the war with Japan, or the Chinese call it the War of Resistance, was not built till 1985, and the famous one by the Marco Polo Bridge was not completed till 1987. That is to say, more than 40 years after the end of the war itself. Now, in some respects, this made it easier for those people who had actually experienced the war. But by that stage, such people had to be at least around 60, if not older. Amongst them was Jiang Zemin, who became a leader a little later. Now, another major step along the way in this development was the implosion or destruction of the Soviet Union. Up till that time, the Soviet Union was considered, with all its flaws, as the motherland of socialism. Deng Xiaoping and Gorbachev, they had mended the relationship, and again they abandoned Mao's approach. And no sooner had Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping sort of improved their relationship, Tiananmen happened, which had the effect of having Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues sort of draw up the drawbridge, feeling very much in danger, and that, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union only 2 years later, meant in effect that socialism was dead as a basis for appealing to the Chinese people. That, of course, had been strengthened by the fact that for the previous 10 years, Deng Xiaoping had led a movement for reform, and over here, all the emphasis has been on economic reform, but very little, in my view, not enough attention has been paid to the political dimensions that underpinned those reforms. And the result was that that as Deng Xiaoping reached his declining years, and Jiang Zemin had been recognized as the main leader, he had to consolidate his position. And one of the ways of consolidating his position, and also meeting the problem, if you like, of the end of socialism, was to emphasize nationalism, and emphasize even more strongly the Japanese dimension, or the anti-Japanese dimension, of Chinese nationalism. It so happens that Jiang Zemin's family, and he himself, were in that part of China that was occupied by Japan. Some Chinese scholars have told me that Jiang, who was then in his teens, had actually got a scar on his leg from being bitten by a military dog, a Japanese dog. Now, whether that's the case or not, I don't know. You can read also accounts in Hong Kong which suggests that far from being a fighter against the Japanese, Jiang Zemin and his family profited from the Japanese occupation. But be that as it may, whether it was to disguise that fact, or whether because he was driven so much by his experiences, Jiang Zemin went out of his way, if you like, to point the finger at Japan. So this brings in, if you like, a second dimension, as well as issues of national identity and legitimacy and so on, but also the role of leaders themselves. And indeed, it fell to Jiang Zemin's successor, Hu Jintao, to be able to opened the relationship with Japan that I mentioned right at the very beginning when Abe went to Beijing and they signed a joint statement. Now, related to this is a peculiar fact that the issue of Japan has always been a contentious one within China. The elite in China has always been divided on the issue of Japan. Curiously, after China's first major defeat by Japan in 1895, most of the Chinese figures who are now famous as intellectual leaders and national leaders went to Japan, arguing that Japan was had succeeded in modernization, and that what China had to do was to really learn from Japan. And so Sun Yat-sen had been there, Zhou Enlai had been there, China's most famous modern writer, Lu Xun, had been there, and so on and so forth. And it was only really around the sort of First World War that things began to turn against Japan because of the way in which Japan was behaving in China itself and so on. But to jump ahead, when Japan itself had become China's most important trading partner once the Sino-Soviet dispute broke out in the 1960s. And even in Deng's day, that is to say, in the first period of reform, from the late 70s through till, let us say, Tiananmen, Japan figured very much in the thinking of Chinese reformers as an inspiration for China's economic reforms. And over here we tend to emphasize very much the American dimension, perhaps quite rightly so, but it shouldn't be overemphasized. And those of you who have read Ezra Vogel's book about Deng Xiaoping will find there are many, many aspects of Deng Xiaoping's admiration for Japan, at least until throughout the 1980s. And the reformers in China to this day feel that this antagonism towards Japan is damaging to China. Of course, there are those in the Ministry of Commerce and others who feel that that this is potentially damaging economically and so on. But beyond that, amongst reformers, there is the view that Japan could play and should play a much more positive role for China. And the forces, as it were, against improving relations with Japan or changing the focus of nationalism tend to be those associated with, if you like, the more hardline communists. You find them in the propaganda department, you find them in the security department, argument being that that China must resist what they sometimes call westernization, and that is sometimes associated in some respects with Japan. So below the surface of anti-Japanese sentiments, there's much, much more going on. Now, this affects, of course, issues of as I mentioned before, issues of identity and so on. But let me say, why do I start with after the Cold War? Because it is really only after the end of the Cold War when the danger from the North, the danger from the Soviet Union, disappears. both for China and for Japan. And for both of them, it had very important domestic consequences as well. But let me deal first with the international ones. For China, it meant that it could devote much more attention to the south and eastern part of China. They no longer had to prepare against a contingency of something from the north, and that, of course, opened the gateways for China to develop much better relations with Southeast Asia and so on. Also to devote more resources to it. It's not surprising that with that comes the development of maritime commerce, and following on from that, the development of a maritime naval capability. In Mao's day, there was still fear of the sea, but his response was to take industry inward, rather than developing the coastal areas itself. So, for example, the province of Fujian, which is opposite Taiwan, hardly had any development and investment during the Mao period. But it's this shift southwards within China was the spur to developing a maritime naval capabilities. And I've already mentioned the effect it had in terms of moving away from socialism or communism and emphasizing much more nationalism and so on, with, of course, the residue of the idea that the Communist Party itself has to stay in power. Now, the effect in Japan was, in one stroke, really to remove what was called the San Francisco system that had been developed in the immediate aftermath of the agreement of the peace settlement of the war that was settled in 1952 in San Francisco, and the arrangements there, which led to, of course, to the ending of the American occupation, set the framework for Japan, which has, in some respects, lasted really until the end of the Cold War. This was the so-called Yoshihide framework, in which the main party was the Liberal Democratic Party, which ruled more or less uninterrupted, and it involved an understanding with the Americans that the Japanese would focus exclusively on economics and leave security issues to the United States. And whenever it came under pressure from the United States to contribute more to regional security, Yoshida and his successors were able to point to the peace constitution and to be able to also to reach, in a sense, tacit understandings with the Socialist Party, which, although could never have enough seats to form a majority, nevertheless had enough seats to prevent a two-thirds or three-quarter majority in the parliament or the diet that would be necessary to reform the constitution. So, in a sense, it was very convenient for both sides. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, very soon that followed on the collapse of the Japanese Socialist Party. And Japan also came under great pressure from the United States to contribute more to American military activities in various parts of the world, and notably in the Middle East. Not soon after, well, around this turning point, there was the first Gulf War. Japan's contribution was exclusively monetary, and the view of the United States at that point was that Here was Japan, which needed the oil from the Middle East, perhaps even more so than the United States. And American boys, if you like, were putting, and others were putting their lives on the line. And all the Japanese were doing was contributing money, as if they were mercenaries. So Japan came under great pressure. And that was followed by the first crisis involving North Korea, which under the Clinton administration apparently reached very nearly the point in which the United States was prepared to use military force. Again, the Japanese contribution was found wanting. So all this pressure led to a new agreement called establishing new defense guidelines for Japan, and in agreement with the United States. And although this didn't change the defense orientation of Japan, nevertheless it made Japan, if you like, more active in the region. Now this timing, which was around 95, 96, coincided with a change in the relationship between Japan and China, as seen from Japan. Because until Tiananmen, the Japanese had a positive view of China. According to opinion polls, the public opinion had something like 80% or more that had positive feelings towards China. The Tiananmen disaster was a big turning point in that. But another facet of it was that the Japanese saw themselves as playing a very positive role in helping the economic development of China. And so the Japanese were active in trying to help the Chinese leadership overcome the stigma of Tiananmen. In fact, the high point of it was the visit of the emperor in 1992 to China. And as you may know, imperial visits from a Japanese side are taken very, very seriously, and they are thought to carry far greater weight than just a political goodwill. And but things began to change very rapidly after that. The Chinese were developing tests of nuclear weapons to do it in advance of the coming into force of the Test Ban Treaty. And also the Chinese were using threatening military moves to try and change political developments within Taiwan. As far as Japan was concerned, the worst bit was firing missiles to bracket Taiwan from the north and the south against its main ports. And those to the north came very close to one or two Japanese islands. And so as far as Japan was concerned, China had not only taken a turn from the worst domestically, but this was now being expressed externally, and it was, and it meant that Japanese views were no longer taken into account, and that Japan itself was coming under pressure. And so that in some ways can be seen as a kind of turning point. And it's from about the mid-90s onwards that you find the beginnings of concerns in Japan about the rise of China. It's from the mid-90s onwards that you begin to find the Chinese sort of pressing Japan, not directly but indirectly, and the and 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 so that the whole issue of how the two viewed each other became not only a question of identities, but began to develop a military strategic dimension. Now, pressing of time, I won't go into all of this, but let me just point out one of the key problems that has emerged, and that is that Japan and China have become opponents in strategic matters that some people call structural. In other words, it's almost impossible for individual leaders to change. And that is this. Japan is a maritime country. For until really the last 2 or 3 decades, China, by contrast, was exclusively a continental one. And despite what is sometimes said officially about their relationship, in fact, Japan and China did not have much a relationship until modern times. But now that China has acquired a maritime capability, now that its leader says that China is becoming a maritime country, the geopolitics of the two has changed. China, from a maritime point of view, China is boxed in by a series of island chains, starting up in the north, the Japanese islands, coming down through to the end of the Ryukyu Islands of Okinawa and so on, coming through Taiwan, through the Philippines, and then into the South China Sea. And the South China Sea also has straits that are not in the hands of Chinese. There's Malacca Straits, and there's straits through Indonesia and so on. And the easiest way for the Japanese, or for the Chinese Navy to have access to the Pacific is to go through straits through Japanese islands, or through the south of Taiwan, the Luzon Straits, which borders the Philippines and so on. So it means that from a Chinese perspective, in the event of hostilities, its access through these straits could be perhaps even stopped altogether. From a Japanese perspective, were the Chinese to establish themselves in control of these straits, becoming a major maritime power in the Western Pacific, then it would mean that Japan's maritime trade would be at the mercy of the Chinese Navy. So this could provide a context in which the two could reach agreements about about the straits and how to ensure that neither does anything against the other and so on. But the current atmosphere militates against that. And from a Japanese perspective, Taiwan is a major strategic issue. If Taiwan were to come under the control of China, and its navy able to use the facilities there, again, it would mean that Japan's maritime trade, on which it depends, would be highly vulnerable. And the effect of this, of course, is underlies the impasse that exists over the Sengaku-Diaoyu Islands. And nothing could be further from the truth from what I hear from occasionally in Washington, of people who, in my view, should know better, who are dismissing the thing as somehow rather a dispute about some rocky islands of little significance. Now, and I think the major task that lies ahead, and it's one in which the United States will have to play a role, is how to overcome this problem. In many respects, the United States has played a major role as a progenitor of this. After all, it is the ally of Japan. It is committed to defend Japan. On the other hand, as we heard from Vice President Biden only the other day, that an important element of the pivot is to have good relations with China, so that the two can play a major global role together in dealing with many of the pressing global issues. Now, how is the United States going to somehow or other manage these two competing sets of roles that it has set itself? I think that is one of the big issues that I think is insufficiently addressed. There's sort of a major contradiction in the United States position, because without Japan and without the working relationship with Japan, the United States would not be able to be a power in the Western Pacific. The United States would also, in effect, lose the capacity to link up easily the Pacific with the Indian Ocean. All of this has been absolutely central to the American position for the last 60 years. I'm not saying it's immediately at issue, but what I'm saying is that there are fundamental structural issues that need to be better understood. And I think with this I'll stop for now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. Can we have a mic check? Is my mic on? Can you all hear me in the back? Can you do a mic check?
Yes, can you hear me?
And Yoshi?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep, okay.
Even I can. So
Well, good. Well, Michael, you've given ample evidence of why the Wilson Center and its great wisdom some years ago invited you to spend time here. You noted that you started on this project when you were here. Let me just make a point. Neither you nor the Wilson Center is responsible for the present deterioration in relations between the two sides. As someone who used to be a historian before he largely succumbed to Potomac fever and started focusing on, as you so correctly put it, the score, let me just thank you for reminding all of us that you can't understand anything today if you don't understand the historical background. And you rightly point out that the debate in Washington, and I think frankly that think tanks, including perhaps the Wilson Center, are partly to blame for this. We Americans simply don't have any sort of historical memory, and thank you for reminding us that these issues just didn't begin in 2010 or last fall or something. One point about your explanation for the current antagonism between the two sides. I would think the Japanese would find much of what you said comforting, in the sense that you have placed the locus of the responsibility, not in a blame sense, but simply this is where developments took place which helped to explain the current rivalry. you put it largely in China. You talked about search for identity and legitimacy. You talked about Chinese acquisition of maritime capabilities more recently. You did talk a bit about U.S. pressure on Japan, encouraging Japan to expand its own capabilities and play a more robust role in world affairs. You talked about Chinese pressure on Taiwan. Your explanation seems, if I were Japanese, I would say, well, good. We don't really have any responsibility for the current impasse. Therefore, we don't have any obligation to do anything about it. The fault, if we can put it crudely, lies on the other side. I'm quite sure that doesn't exactly represent your views, but I wonder if you could address that.
Well, another way of thinking about the last 20 years is that Japan has been very much, well, as some people put it, Japan has been relatively stagnant and facing the rise of China. And China, as you know, has become the second economy, surpassing Japan and so on. So in that sense, I think, looked at from a very broad perspective, Japan has not been pressurizing China, but China has been pressing Japan. On the other hand, going back to the history aspect, Japan, or the majority of people in Japan, have not really addressed the big historical issues stemming from the war. And I think that this failure is a Japanese problem. I think coming up from the end of the Cold War, with Japan wanting to play a greater international role, if you remember, it was in the early 90s where the Japanese thought that they had an entitlement to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and they were going to offer something very special as a peace-loving country, as they have uniquely pursued a peaceful path since the end of the war, and so on. In a way, elided over that larger question. And clearly, that's not true for their neighbors. Now, I've tried to suggest that on the Chinese side, there's been a sort of a playing of politics with this. And indeed, Chinese leaders have played politics with their own history too. But nevertheless, there is a historical issue between the two, and it's a genuine one, even more so with regard to Korea. And so I think that's point number one. Point number two is that the Japanese have not done very much to assuage the susceptibilities of their neighbors, primarily China and South Korea. It's true that that there have been some very moving statements by some Japanese prime ministers about the harmful past and the harm they'd done to others. They could have been a bit more forthcoming, but the trouble has been that other leaders have then gone back again. And so it's almost as if they've gone out of their way to antagonize their neighbors. With regard to China, you know, why keep on going to the Ascuni shrine when, after all, there are other ways in which Japanese leaders can express their feelings for those soldiers who had died in the war, and especially as neighbors had said how they feel about this. The Japanese as well, I think, have been excessively legalistic in the way they have dealt with what are essentially humanitarian problems. So the Japanese certainly have not really set about creating a better atmosphere. And the comparison is always made with Germany. And there's something to it, although unlike Germany, Japan was not invited to become members of the equivalent, if there were such a thing, of the European community, in which they had to really build on a better relationship with neighbors. Nor was it invited to join something like NATO, but nor was there a NATO there. So Japan, in a sense, stuck in its own groove, and we now have a situation in which we have a prime minister who is the grandson of someone who was released from prison before indictment as a Class A war criminal. So while not necessarily going out of its way to antagonize neighbors, nevertheless, the way it has addressed these huge historical issues, I think, can be regarded as provocative.
Yoshi, let's bring you into this conversation. There are many people in Japan who would disagree with certain elements of Michael's comments in response to my question. Why has it been so difficult for Japan or the Japanese or successive Japanese governments to take the actions that would largely put these types of questions to rest once and for all? Or is that the wrong question? Is it the view, is it your view, is it a view that most Japanese feel that Japan has done everything it should have done, could have done? It has not, to use Michael's phrase, addressed the history questions in an overly legalistic manner. It has been sensitive to the views of its neighbors. So sort of how does this question play out in Japan, including going forward?
Thank you for setting a stage for me to come in in a very difficult way. Well, I think in a way a scholarly answer to that question is in this book. Not necessarily the words that Michael has just expressed, but in a more scholarly approach in analyzing the dynamism of Sino-Japanese relations and the place of this history question in a much bigger context. And what Michael has just said, and what Bob, you have just described as one of the interpretations, pretty much in line with Michael's remarks. I understand that aspect is also regarded as a problem for many Japanese themselves, but not necessarily because of the reasons that you implied in identifying what you perceive as most of Japanese views on this issue, which is we've done everything and so forth. First of all, this is a very difficult issue of domestic politics and identity politics, and which is very much referred to in Michael's analysis. And I think that is a very important point. And that identity politics is embroiled in the vicious cycle between Chinese identity politics and Japanese identity politics. So things are getting worse as identity politics in both countries resonate with each other. I think that's the basic theme of this. So I like this book very much. I should have said this at the outset. For two major reasons, but first reason I'll put it aside until this comes up later. But as far as so-called Japan problems is concerned, this book is very good in putting Japan problem in perspective. And let me quote the first few sentences from his chapter 1, which is on politics of history and identity. Most writers on contemporary Sino-Japanese relations pay much attention to the historical legacy of Japan's brutal aggression in Asia in the first half of the 20th century, and to the failure of the Japanese adequately to come to terms with the history of those atrocities. It is further asserted that until Japan does address that history adequately, it will remain a running sore in Japan's relation with China and the two Koreas. I will argue that such a view is too simplistic. A careful account of when and how animosity towards Japan in China came to be based on those historical charges will show that these took place because of changes in the domestic politics of identity within China. And in this context, Michael emphasizes the importance of Deng Xiaoping. He started reform and open door policies. And as his visit to Japan in 1978, when he launched these very ambitious plans, indicates, Japan was the very first country which China looked at as a kind of external source of both official development assistance as well as foreign direct investment. And Japan was a very strong engine in promoting Deng Xiaoping's open door reform policy, no question about that. But the flip side of that had to do with the shift of Chinese identity politics from Mao Zedong's era to Deng Xiaoping era. And I think his point that history education in China became very much explicit since the Deng Xiaoping period. And so he started sort of patriotism education, socially, first of all, by establishing war memorials and all over China, right in the middle of the 1980s, when China started this open door. So I think this two sides of the same coin, I think it involves many difficult dilemmas and contradictions. And Japan eventually became the victim of this contradiction in the Chinese debate about its identity. This is what is being discussed here. And on the one hand, reform orientation is a new identity of China, but still they have to maintain solidarity of a Communist Party of China, CCP. And in order to maintain solidarity at the age of opening up, they strategically decided to use history as a source of cohesion of Chinese society and the people. And so it's not a coincidence that history problem became the diplomatic issue for the first time in the post-war history of Japan's external relations with anybody, for the first time in the middle of 1980s, or the first part of 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping decided to grab on the Japanese report of a newspaper talking about so-called instructing to change, advance into aggression. And so it took a month before Chinese government decided to make an issue out of this. And it took another month for the Chinese society to finish this. So this was a very well calculated, well planned decision on the part of China to make a history issue vis-a-vis Tokyo. And this is, I think, part of this Deng Xiaoping's sort of, identity politics. And I think that point is very important for me. And what that implies is, if I may have 2 or 3 minutes, I think this, again, post-war evolution is very important. For instance, how and why the textbook inspection started in Japan. It was precisely because power of liberal pacifists was so strong in the Japanese society soon after the war, understandably and naturally. And so the tendency was to look at the past history almost totally in a negative light. And college professors, intellectuals, are the writers of textbooks and commercially produced textbooks. And their writing of the history all total denounce of Japanese militarism and the strong support for pacifism, including the constitution. And so that gave a sense of crisis on the part of establishments, because maybe too liberal, too pacifist, and too leftist oriented. And the influence of Marxism in Japanese academia was very strong soon after the post-war years. And so that threatened the establishment, not because of necessarily kind of rightist ideology or anything of that sort. It's a sort of a reaction against too liberal and sometimes too Marxist intellectual tradition in the post-war Japanese society. So that was the beginning of this textbook inspection system. So the original motive was to check two leftist arguments. And so that evolved over time throughout the post-war years. So during those years, every observer of Japan knew that pacifists dominated, and the negative views toward history dominated the Japanese perception. And but flip side of that is, I think Michael is right in pointing this out. There was not serious attempts to teach the history in a totally negative way, socially and the textbooks. Tendency is to emphasize the victim mentality or victim side of that history. Japanese people were victims of, even militarism, of course. And the Japanese victims, the society was a victim of American atomic bombs, and the victims of the war. So victim mentality, emphasis on victim mentality. I think that was a sort of common denominator in how Japanese postal society attempted to remember the past history. And so that eventually, started to create a kind of vacuum in which, sort of vicious cycle started in more recent years after Deng Xiaoping period in the history question. I mean, Chinese views about history, tried to gradually create this sort of sense of uneasiness and uncertainty among many Japanese, simply because they didn't have the full grasp of past history, not necessarily in totally negative way. But that doesn't mean that they had a positive view. I mean, here, if I may, some kind of ignorance. And I think that's the problem. That's our problem in terms of this history question. So ignorance creates a sort of vacuum in which, if this vicious cycle becomes very serious because of identity politics, which is described here, then that will certainly give totally negative impact upon Japanese society. And so which created a domestic political environment in which government has to operate in facing the past. But having said that, I think as a Japanese, I may have a bias, but I think Japanese governments have done reasonably good job in facing the past history, particularly in the 1990s, after the change of security environments. Because that forced Japan to restructure its external policies as well as external relations naturally. And in reestablishing our new external relations, of course, history question was perceived reasonably to be very critical, particularly in terms of Japan's relation with neighbors, China and Korea. So in the 1990s, there was a series of attempts from Miyazawa government, Kono statement about comfort women. In fact, the comfort women, Kono statement is a joint product of Seoul and Tokyo. Governments and Korea and governments of Japan worked very closely and worked on the draft jointly. And finally, Korean side agreed to that Kono statement. And that's how Kono statement came out as from Miyazawa cabinet. And then came Prime Minister Hosokawa, who talked about past history as an aggression, of course, and apologized, for instance, in Korea, in a nationally televised, prime time television network. and mentioning changing names and so forth. And then came Murayama Statement in 1995, and then came Kimudejin Obuchi Joint Declaration in 1998, and this clearly inserting the term apology in the Joint Declaration for the first time after the end of the war. And then came Janzumin Obuchi Joint Declaration, in which Obuchi agreed to talk about aggression. The term aggression is there clearly, and also express its deep remorse toward Chinese victims. So there are a series of those attempts. And the point here is those things became possible given very complex domestic politics, in which voices of conservative politicians were not necessarily in harmony with these government statements. But here, the important point is, despite that complexity in domestic politics, those things came out as official statements from the Japanese government. And I think that is very important. But gradually, people forgot about those things and then came back to the original, very widespread kind of argument, which is started by Michael, saying most views tend to demonize Japan, and so Japan, and if Japan doesn't change, things will not getting better. And I think that view is too simplistic. And so this Japan problem, as I said, is a problem for many of us, in Japan too. And we want to present our new policies, our new sense of direction in a different way. And so this is a common issue between many in Japan, I would say, and many in China or South Korea, or for that matter, for the US. And so the current vicious cycle, which is analyzed by Michael, doesn't help for that to happen. And that's how I like to put Japan question into perspective based on Michael's excellent analysis.
Good, thank you. I want to bring you all into the discussion. I'm going to make two quick points that about Michael's presentation that struck me as particularly noteworthy and important, but I'm not going to ask you all to respond because I want to bring others into the question. First of my 2 points, Michael, was toward the end of your talk. You went away from the burden of history on this relationship, if you would, and began to talk about some of the structural explanations of the current rivalry between the two countries. That suggests to me that it's going to be even more difficult to manage this relationship between China and Japan than if it were simply a case of failures of leadership on one or both sides. That's the first point. The second point is you suggested, and you didn't suggest, you said the United States clearly has a role to play in diffusing the current tensions, and particularly the tensions over Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands, and you underscored some of the major contradictions in the U.S. approach to the region. Important points, maybe some in the audience will want to explore them, but I think they're worth underscoring. Now, you in the audience, Stephen right here, and Sandy, if you'll wait for the microphone to get to you, and if you'll briefly identify yourself.
Stephen, sure. I thought interesting presentation, but is it really fair to make this predominantly a Sino-Japanese issue when China has border disputes with nearly all its neighbors, the Spratlys with the Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, and in terms of an actual shooting war, wasn't more of the old Chinese empire lost to Siberia than these little island specks in the Pacific? And Russia and China did get into a shooting war in 1969, although the possibility of this recurring today is eliminated. And also there is the idea of Japan, Itorofu and Kunoshiri are arguably as least as Japanese as the territory disputed with China, and yet China, Japan and Russia are not, and do not get into violent conflicts over the return of Itorofu and Kunoshiri. And also to me, it's
Stephen, better let it go there because we don't have a whole lot of time. Thank you. Michael, you want to start that?
Well, yes, I mean, the China-Japan relationship is central in many ways to the emergence of China compared to any of the others. To put it very crudely, the rivalry between China and India does not really involve the subjugation of one to the other. I mean, at worst, it may mean that they would have another border war or something of that sort. As far as Russia is concerned, it's true that many people in Moscow fear in the longer term Chinese absorption of some parts of Asian Russia. But again, I don't think it really threatens Russia at all. Nor, of course, does Russia really threaten China or India threaten China. The others that you mentioned are not really great big problems for China. I mean, the Vietnamese and the Chinese are really comparing a small country with an enormous country, and that they will find ways of managing their relationships which would not sort of threaten China's vision of itself as a great country. Whereas the question of Japan does. I know that's why I call it the two tigers, because however you regard Japan, it's still the third largest economy in the world. Its technology is amongst the highest and most advanced in the world. It plays a part in the Chinese economy that is crucial in the sense of its role in the production chain. Japan is also pivotal to and I don't mean this in the contemporary term, but is central to America's capacity to be to continue to be the major power in the Western Pacific. So in many respects, Japan is perhaps China's most important neighbor, while at the same time it is, from a Chinese perspective, the main obstacle to its being able to achieve the aspirations that it has, and nobody knows the full extent of them. And this is really references to the Chinese past I don't think are terribly helpful in this regard. So I think the key task for China's leaders in the future is not just a question of managing America, but is managing the relationship with Japan. And clearly one of the objectives of the Chinese leadership is to try and drive a wedge between Japan and the United States. And it has had some success. And if you were to read American newspapers over the Sengoku period, there's a sense in which quite a number of them put part of the responsibility on Japan. They argue the nationalization of those 3 islands was crucial. Well, that's nonsense. Japan had claimed sovereignty over these islands, and it doesn't matter one jot in legal terms whether the ownership of that is held by a private individual or by the state. If the United States were to choose to nationalize an oil company, that's a domestic matter. It doesn't affect anything larger. Or if indeed America were to decide that they want to sell off some of the smaller islands in Hawaii, does that mean that there would be a reduction of sovereignty? It wouldn't affect sovereignty one one iota. And yet people here buy the Chinese complaint that somehow or other nationalization was a provocation that changed things. I don't understand it.
Yoshi, any
Yeah.
any brief comment?
Sure. This is, in fact, the first point that I wanted to mention about this book, and about which I liked very much. Let me quote again to prove that I have read this book. And, well, in fact, I bought this book before this symposium was planned. So I didn't do this just for this, and I'm a good scholar. And, well, there is a quote from the People's Daily. Japan is at the high end of the global industrial chain, while China is at its low end manufacturing base. Every year, China imports parts and components of the assembly of products that are then exported worldwide. These Japanese-made components include high-tech and high-value-added products that are not easily replaced. Just recall how the tsunami and nuclear accident in Japan last year set back the electronics and auto industries in the US, Europe, and China. So this is People's Daily's column. And this tells pretty much how economic interdependence is important. And so that's one picture. But the another picture is, as Michael said, and is discussed here, China regards Japan as an obstacle in its ambition to reestablish itself at the center of a new Asian order. And these two do not coincide. I mean, essence contradiction. And so the point here is Japan's-China relationship is a sort of epitome of a dilemma and contradiction entailing the rise of China today in general, very much. So this People's Daily column implies and explicitly says China success, future economic success will never be achieved without continuing to work with advanced industrial democracies in a constructive way. That's how Deng Xiaoping started his trip to Japan in the late 1970s. So just to use a simple term, I mean, if you use the term liberal international order, for China to continue to rise, it has to remain within the established liberal international order, which is a creation of the US, Europe, and Japan later joined this group in creating and sustaining a liberal international order. So China in this order, I think, is very much important. But at the same time, Chinese aspiration, influenced by its very peculiar nationalism, which is a combination of victim mentality regarding the past 2 or 3 decades history, and the confidence coming from today's rise of China. So, combination of victim mentality in the history and confidence from today's rise, I think they make up a very complex Chinese nationalism, and which leads to the Chinese argument today, I mean, looking for a new type of great power relations with the United States, which I think in effect is saying that US should respect Chinese sphere of influence in Asia and maybe Western Pacific. And so that sentiment is also getting explicit in these years. And these two, again, do not reconcile with each other. China in a liberal international order and China aspiring to sort of, in a way, coming back to the past where China was dominant in Asia. And so Sino-Japanese problems are, in fact, epitomes of these very general problems of contradiction associated with the rise of China. And I think that's basically what Michael said when Japan is not Vietnam. I mean, those things, if you read deep into the relationship, I think it's possible to read these general implications from maybe any bilateral relations which China has with regional countries. But because of the peculiar nature of history and the bilateral relationship, I think these problems tend to become much, much more explicit in Sino-Japanese exchanges. And so it's a huge, huge problem for Japan. It's not only a bilateral question. We are dealing with this contradiction associated with the rise of China. So Japan alone taking up this task is an impossible task. And we have to work with regional countries and the US and everybody. Not because we have to contain China, but because of this very profound historic nature of the problems associated with the rise of China.
Good. Let's lump two questions. Eric and then Ben.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Over the last decade, I think I saw the disputes between Japan and China in the East China Sea in a significant measure over seabed resources. That seems to have been overwhelmed by the nationalism. Is that still a component? Is there any hope that maybe that can play a role, maybe even a role to ameliorate things somewhat?
Ben?
Thank you. Ben Self, CSIS. There we go. Ben Self, CSIS. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I was particularly struck by your description of the identity formation process in China and the question of China identifying itself or forming a new national identity against an other, which in this case seems to be Japan specific, but generally China is casting about for an appropriate rival. And I think as you described Japan falling out of love with China in the mid-1990s, I see that as the point where Japan ceased to identify itself against the United States, that the post-Cold War emergence of Japan as a potential alternative pole in the Western Pacific, distancing or separating from the United States, ended at about 1994. Japan re-entered the alliance framework and became friendly with the United States again, and then started to view China with a much more negative eye. And we see China's rise, China casting about for an appropriate other or an appropriate rival to identify itself against. Certainly we've seen occasionally China look to the United States as that rival. And after the Lehman crisis, where the United States seemed to be in sharp decline, the Chinese appeared to be entering into a period of challenging the United States on a global level. Clearly they're pulling back from that and are focused much more on Japan at the regional level. So to get finally to my question, do you think that if China's rise continues, China's relative gains against the United States and the international system, that China can overlook Japan, as they've said, Schauerben, we can ignore little Japan and focus on the big, true great power of the United States? Do you see that as a potential outcome of China's continued rise? Or do you see that China is really caught into this bilateral dynamic with Japan that it can't transcend, even as it grows much, much more powerful? Thank you.
I think, Michael, both of those questions are directed primarily to you. We're out of time, so if you can, with some brevity, address both of them, and then Yoshi, I'll see if you have any last things to add as well.
Well, I'll be very brief. As far as the question of resources, I know that's still there. I don't think the resources are that significant as to really make a fundamental difference to the economies of either. On the other hand, it does allow for a room out, in the sense that one possibility of reducing the tensions is for both sides tacitly to recognize that neither can drive out the other, let us say, from the islands in dispute, and yet they could follow the Taiwan example and agree about fishery resources, agree about maybe how they could jointly exploit whatever resources might be. In fact, there is a framework for it, which I think it was Premier Fukuda signed with Hu Jintao, at least the beginnings of an arrangement to jointly develop something that had already been started on the Chinese side, but that came to an end. So I think rather than saying they're important, they can provide a way out if both sides were able to seize it. On the larger issue that Ben raises, I think that all of this is very selective. one that both, for example, South Korea and China could draw on as an alternative to this, to America and Japan as problem areas, is Russia. After all, Russia committed enormous atrocities when it took over Manchuria at the end of the war, and Mao at a certain stage said we haven't made our sort of proper claims for the return of all that vast territory that was ceded to the Tsars. As far as the South Koreans are concerned, you could argue it's strange that somehow they remember the period up to 45, but have forgotten about what happened in 1950, between 1950 and 53. So when politics intrudes, I think history, as we know it, takes a different turn altogether. And I think that, as I said before, Japan poses very special kinds of problems to China, and it would take, I think, great statesmanship on both sides to recognize that they have a mountain to share. That is not a question of having only one tiger on one mountain, as the Chinese says.
Yoshi?
If I may just briefly, about 3 points. First, not substantial. The subject of my talk on January 26th, which Bob introduced, is A Normal Japan in East Asia, subtitle Comparing Experiences with ASEAN, Korea, and China. And so I'm gonna repeat many of the things which I said today, but and this is
Don't tell him that.
oh no, I will say totally new things. And so please allow me to mention some corrections about my bio, because there are some serious mistakes. I'm sorry to say this, but I've already stepped down as director of the Institute of East Asian Studies, KO, so I will not return to this post. So don't write to me expecting that I'll still be director. And my sabbatical is until summer next year, so therefore I don't go back to KO. And from March to May, I will be in Seoul. I will be affiliated with Asan Institute, and I'm going to deal with Japan, Korea in my next round of my research. And sorry about that. The substantial point is in response to your question about kind of resource management, possibly being a sort of solution, if only in the medium term. I think for that to happen, of course, the sovereignty issue is very important. And now Chinese side is saying that Japan should agree to shelve this issue, and which, according to their argument, is what Prime Minister Tanaka and some other leaders, agreed to in the previous years. But that's a wrong definition of this case from our point of view. There was no explicit case of agreeing to shelve this issue. There was no such official case. So that is a non-starter as far as Japan is concerned. But Japan's position has been for a long time, until recently, to put it aside. And there is a significant difference between putting it aside and shelving. Shelving is a political diplomatic agreement. But putting it aside is a sort of indirect way of handling this issue in a non-controversial way, which basically you don't mention it. You don't touch the sovereignty issue. That's how a fishery agreement between Japan and China was renegotiated and signed in the year 2000. And that's how Taiwan-Japan fishery agreement in recent years came to actual signing. So this was just putting aside. You don't mention sovereignty issue, but it's a de facto shelving, because negotiations are based on the recognition that there are conflicting interests and assertions. So you just avoid some direct agreements about those contested areas. So it's a de facto shelving, but without talking about the sovereignty issue. You just put it aside. So that's been the Japanese approach toward China as far as this issue is concerned after diplomatic normalization. And for the sake of course, peaceful and productive management of the relationship, to help Chinese modernization programs. And our official slogan has long been stability of Sino-Japanese relationship is very good for East Asia as well as for the world. And the Chinese economic development is good for Chinese political, social development. And so helping Deng Xiaoping's reform strategy was a very important component of Japanese China policy for many years since Deng Xiaoping's period. And so during those years, we didn't touch this sensitive issue when issue came out. And so that has been Japanese approach about the issue. But the Chinese side is now saying, you agreed to shelve formally, so you have to do that now. And so, but it's not going to happen from our side. So if there is a hope, I think if things subside, and if Chinese side also reaches a situation where they do not have to mention this issue, then there will be a way out of this. But given sensitivity of the issue in Chinese domestic politics and at the level of nationalism, I'm afraid Michael is correct in his conclusion that that is not likely to happen in the near future.
Well, I hate to end on a negative note, so let me end on a positive note. I want to thank my two colleagues here for reminding us that history is important. As I said earlier, we too often lose sight of that. And also want to thank you for making another point, which I believe is absolutely essential, but I'm not sure is conveyed to our students. You cannot understand foreign policy of a country if you don't understand the domestic politics first. I don't think there's a single important foreign policy initiative of the last 100 years that hasn't had an important domestic policy component. So thank you all for underscoring that. Thank you all for coming on behalf of the Kissinger Institute and the Asia program. Two last reminders. Number one, January 21, 4 o'clock. He will not tell you the same thing he told you today. So come back and join us then. Number two, it's the season of buying gifts for loved ones, so buy a copy of the book. Join me now in expressing our appreciation to our two speakers. If I don't see you again before the end of the year, happy holidays and happy New Year.